The morning Mamie Whitfield drove her cattle into the county fairgrounds at Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, every man within eyeshot stopped what he was doing and stared. Not at her, at first, but at the animals she had raised, and the staring at her came later, slower, the way a man realizes he has been standing in the rain without noticing the sky had changed. She had 63 head of longhorn crossbreeds, each one broad-backed and deep-chested, their hides gleaming like polished copper in the September light. They moved in a tight, obedient procession because she had trained them that way, because she had spent the better part of 3 years learning everything a man twice her age might have learned in 10, because there had been no other choice. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had died of a fever in the spring of 1879, leaving her with 400 acres of sun-cracked Kansas grassland, a half-built barn, 2 horses, 7 cattle too old and lean to sell, and a son named Eli who had just turned 8 years old and could not yet reach the top of the fence post. She was 31 years old now. She had earned every one of those years on her face. The cattle she brought to Caldwell that September were not the cattle of a woman who had simply survived. They were the cattle of a woman who had studied. She had ridden to the Kishom Trail twice to speak with drovers coming up from Texas. She had read every agricultural pamphlet the Kansas Pacific Railroad distributed to settlers along the line. She had bartered her way into breeding stock from a rancher named Hollis Prout, who lived 20 miles east of her property, a coarse man who had underestimated her so thoroughly that he sold her 2 prize bulls at half the going rate simply because he did not believe a widow could do anything useful with them. She had done something useful with them. She had done something magnificent with them. The cattle she was selling that day were the result of her last truly extraordinary season, a summer that had given her rain when she needed it, sun when the grass needed to dry, and a run of luck with no sickness that she knew perfectly well could not be counted upon to repeat itself. She was selling nearly all of them. She needed the money to buy more land before winter, to fix the eastern fence line that the last windstorm had taken apart post by post, and to put away enough to carry her and Eli through whatever the next 2 years might bring. She was not sentimental about selling them. She was practical. She had learned to be practical the way a person learns to breathe through their mouth when their nose is broken, not because it was preferred, but because it was necessary. She was standing at the gate of the holding pen, counting heads for the 3rd time and writing figures in a small leather-bound notebook, when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her and a voice that was low and unhurried. "Those yours?" She did not look up immediately. She finished the number she was writing. "They are," she said. "All 63. 63 present, 67 total. 4 are still at my place. I couldn't move them all in one drive with just myself and my son and one hired hand." She looked up then, because something in the pause that followed told her the man was not walking away, as men usually did, when they found out a woman was in charge of the transaction. He was tall in the manner of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life, the kind of tall that came not from being born long, but from carrying himself fully upright even when tired. His hat was brown and weathered, its brim shaped by years of use rather than by any particular vanity. His face was lean and angular, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes that were an unexpected shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. He was perhaps 35, perhaps 37, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into distances rather than from age. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen many miles of trail. There was nothing decorative about him except, she noticed, a silver watch chain at his vest pocket, the only detail on him that suggested he might have any money at all. "Jasper Graves," he said, and extended his hand. She took it without hesitation. "Mamie Whitfield." His grip was firm, and he did not hold on longer than was appropriate, but he did look at her for a half-second past the length of a customary greeting. She had been looked at before. She was accustomed to men deciding what they thought of her in the first moment they saw her, and carrying that decision forward without revision. This man looked as though he was reserving his decision, which was unusual enough that she noted it. "I came down from Wichita to buy breeding stock," he said. "I have a spread up near the Arkansas River about 30 miles north. I need 10, 12 good animals, heifers if you've got them. I've got 7 heifers in this pen. The rest are steers." "What are you paying?" He named a price per head that was fair, not generous but fair. She named a price that was 15% above that. He did not flinch. He looked at the cattle again, walked slowly along the fence line, paused at one heifer who stood apart from the others with her head up and her eyes bright and alert. He studied that animal for a long time. "This one right here," he said. "She's out of a different sire than the others." Mamie blinked. She had not expected him to notice. "She is. The rest are out of my first Proot bull. She's out of a different line. I got lucky with her dam's conception on the second bull. Better bone structure. Better temperament too, if I'm reading her correctly." "You're reading her correctly." He turned and looked at Mamie directly. "You know these animals better than I know most people." There was a small silence, and then something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He looked back at the cattle and then back at her, and she had the distinct sense that he was recalculating something, the way a man does when the ground beneath him turns out to be different from what the map suggested. "I'll pay your price for 6 heifers," he said, "and I'd like to discuss the other 4 you have back at your property." "You'd need to come out and see them." "I'd need to come out and see them," he agreed. She wrote the figures in her notebook. She gave him the address of her spread, which was technically 38 miles from Caldwell, a full day's ride, and he wrote it in a small book of his own that he pulled from his shirt pocket. They shook hands again on the price for the 6 heifers. His eyes stayed on her face a moment too long again, and she decided to notice it, and then set it aside because she had a pen of cattle to sell and a fence line to fix and a son who needed new boots before winter. She did not think about Jasper Graves for the rest of that day. She thought about him on the ride home. The drive back to the Whitfield property took her and her hired hand, a quiet Tejano man named Cayo who had worked for her for 2 years and never once questioned her authority, the better part of 2 days. They pushed the remaining steers and heifers ahead of them in the long golden light of a Kansas autumn, the grass on either side of the trail the color of dried honey, the sky so blue it looked painted. Eli rode beside her for the first stretch, his small horse keeping up with hers, chattering about the things he had seen at the fairgrounds. A man with a trained dog, a display of wheat varieties, a stall selling peppermint candy that he had convinced her to buy him 2 sticks of. He was 11 now, her boy. He had Thomas's ears and her eyes and a solemnity about him that sometimes caught her off guard, a way of watching the world that was older than his years. He had been to the Caldwell Fair twice before and had never once complained about riding or the dust or the long hours. He was becoming, she thought, the kind of man she would have liked his father to be, and she felt the complicated mixture of grief and pride that came with that thought. "Mama," he said, as they rode through the last stretch of familiar country before home, "the man at the cattle pen, the one you were talking to for a long time. He bought 6 heifers," she said. "He's coming to look at the other 4. He seemed nice." "He seemed like a buyer," she said, which was true enough. Eli was quiet for a while. Then he said, "He looked at you the way Mr. Calder looks at Mrs. Calder." "Eli, I'm just saying what I saw. Keep your observations to your cattle and your schoolwork." He grinned, which was Thomas's grin exactly, and she had to look away at the horizon to compose herself. Jasper Graves arrived at the Whitfield property 10 days later, on a Thursday morning when the first real cold of the season was beginning to make itself known in the early hours, the grass stiff with frost before the sun came up and soft and brown by mid-morning. She had not told Cayo specifically when the man was expected, only that a buyer was coming, and so when the single rider appeared on the long approach road that ran from the main trail to the farmhouse, She was the one who saw him first from the porch where she was checking fence wire. He sat his horse well. She noticed that first, the easy way he rode, as if the horse was an extension of his thinking rather than a tool he was operating. The horse was a good one, a tall bay with white stockings, well kept and steady. He rode at a comfortable walk and did not hurry as he came down the long track, and she had time to observe him before he could observe her being observed. She walked out to meet him at the yard gate because the alternative was standing on the porch, and that seemed like something a woman who was trying to be impressive might do, and she was not trying to be impressive. She was trying to sell cattle. He dismounted before he reached the gate, which she respected. A man who dismounted to approach a woman's home was a man with manners that mattered. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Graves." She unlatched the gate for him. "Tie your horse at the post there. I'll show you the animals." He tied the bay and fell into step beside her as she led him toward the east pasture. The farm was not grand. She had no illusions about that. The house was a sturdy two-story frame construction that Thomas had started and she had finished, its paint worn thin on the south side, where the weather hit it hardest, its roof recently re-shingled with lumber she had traded 2 steers for. The barn was large and solid, and represented more of her own labor than any single other thing on the property. The fences were tight where she had repaired them, and still sagging in the east section she had not yet gotten to. The pasture was well grazed but not overgrazed. Divided by internal fences she had built herself to manage the rotation of her animals. She had planted a kitchen garden near the house, and a small apple orchard of 6 trees that Thomas had put in the year before he died, and that she had kept alive through 3 dry summers through pure stubbornness. Jasper Graves looked at all of it as they walked. She could feel him taking inventory the way a knowledgeable person takes inventory, not with the quick dismissive glance of a man who had already decided what he was seeing, but with the slow, careful attention of someone genuinely assessing. "You built the barn yourself," he said. "I had help from my hired man and a neighbor for the raising. The interior work and the framing was mine. It's a fine barn. It does the job." The 4 heifers were in the east pasture, and they came to the fence when Mamie appeared, which pleased her. It showed they were handled well, used to human presence and calm. Jasper stood at the fence for a long time, saying very little, watching them move, watching how they held their weight, checking their legs and their eyes from a respectful distance. "I'd like to examine them closer if you don't object," he said. "I don't object." She went into the pasture with him and handled the animals herself. Holding each one steady by a halter, she slipped on with practiced efficiency. He ran his hands along their backs and checked their teeth and looked at their hooves, and he was good at it. She could see that his knowledge was genuine, not the performed knowledge of a man trying to seem competent in front of a woman. "The second one," he said, nodding at a heifer with a broad red and white face. "What do you want for her specifically?" Mamie told him. He countered. She countered back. They went 2 rounds and she held her number and he accepted it, which told her he thought the animal was worth it and had only negotiated out of habit. "I'll take all 4, he said. "Same rate as the last." "Agreed." They stood in the pasture in the pale October light, the heifers moving off to the far end to graze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the property with a sound like paper being turned. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted its weight and a board creaked. "You've done something considerable here," he said. "This spread." She looked at him to see if he was being polite. His face said he was not. "I had a good season," she said. "Better than I deserved, maybe. Better than most men in this county managed with twice the hands." She felt something warm move through her chest and immediately distrusted it. "I had good stock to begin with, and a dry summer last year cost most folks their pasture. Mine was irrigated enough from the creek. You're generous with the credit you give luck. I'm careful with the credit I give myself," she said. "It's a shorter road to trouble when you start believing you can't fail." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not admiration exactly, or it was not only that. There was something more complicated in it, something almost like recognition, as if he was seeing in her something he had thought a great deal about without knowing where to find it. "Will you allow me to water my horse before I start back?" He said. "I'll do better than that," she said. "Eli will have started the midday meal by now. You're welcome to eat before you ride." She did not know why she said it. It was not the practical thing to do. The practical thing was to conclude the transaction, sign the bill of sale she had already written out, and send the man back up the trail toward Wichita. She had no particular desire for company. She had been alone for 3 years and had made peace with it in the way that solitude, given long enough, begins to feel like preference. But she said it, and he accepted it, and they walked back to the house. Eli had indeed started the midday meal, a pot of beans with salt pork, and a pan of cornbread that he had learned to make from her recipe and had almost mastered, the corners only slightly burned this time. He looked up from the stove when Mamie came in with a tall stranger, and did the quick assessment that children do, taking in the man's size and his hat still in his hand, and the fact that he had crossed the threshold which not many men did. "Eli, this is Mr. Graves. He's bought the 4 East pasture heifers. Mr. Graves, this is my son Eli." Jasper Graves crouched slightly to address the boy at closer to eye level, which cost him nothing in dignity and gave him a great deal in Mamie's estimation. "You help your mother run this place?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Eli said. "I handle the morning feeding, and I fix the south fence section." "That's considerable work for a man your size." Eli straightened slightly at being called a man. "I'll grow into the rest of it." Jasper Graves laughed, not a polite laugh. A real one, brief and genuine, and Eli grinned, and turned back to the stove with the dignity of someone who had made a good impression and knew it. They ate the beans and cornbread at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and the conversation moved from cattle to weather to the price of land along the Arkansas River to the state of the Kishom Trail, since the cattle towns had begun their various civic campaigns against the drovers. Mamie listened as much as she spoke, because she had learned that a person talking told you far more about themselves than a person listening, and she was still in the business of determining what kind of man Jasper Graves was. He was from Tennessee originally, he said. Had come west in 1871 when he was 24 years old, bought land near Wichita with money he had saved from 3 years of working trail drives out of Texas. Had been building his operation slowly and deliberately for 11 years. He had no partner and no family on the property, only 2 hired men who worked year-round and additional hands during the cattle season. He spoke of his land with the same matter-of-fact affection she recognized in herself when she talked about the Whitfield spread, the language of someone for whom the land was not an investment or a backdrop, but the actual substance of their life. He did not ask her about her husband. Most men who came to her property found a way to establish the husband's absence early and then proceed accordingly, either with barely concealed condescension toward a woman running a property alone, or with something more predatory that she had learned to recognize and redirect firmly. Jasper Graves asked her nothing about Thomas and talked about her work as if it had simply been done by the person who had done it, without needing to name the absence that surrounded it. She found this restful. She was surprised to find it restful. After the meal, he helped Eli clear the plates without being asked, which made Eli stare at him with barely concealed astonishment, and made Mamie turn toward the window for a moment to collect her expression. He left in the early afternoon, having paid her in full and arranged to have the 4 heifers driven north by his man, who would come down in 2 weeks. He shook her hand at the yard gate and held it exactly as long as appropriate and not 1 moment longer. He swung up onto the bay horse with the easy movement of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "it was a genuine pleasure. Safe riding, Mr. Graves." He turned the horse and went back down the long approach road, and she watched him go longer than she intended to, long after she had any practical reason to still be watching, until the bay horse and the man on it were a small dark shape against the vast pale sky and then nothing at all. "Mama," Eli said from directly behind her, in a tone that was entirely too knowing for an 11-year-old. "Start on your arithmetic," she said. The transaction was done. The heifers were sold. She had the money she needed for the land purchase and the fence and the winter stores. That was all this had been. She went back to the barn and spent the rest of the afternoon repairing a stall partition that had been on her to-do list for 2 weeks, working steadily and without pause, which was how she handled things she did not want to think about. He came back in November. She was in the south pasture checking on 2 cows she had held back from the sale when she heard the hoofbeats on the approach road and looked up to see the tall bay with the white stockings, unmistakable at a distance. She felt something quick and involuntary move through her before she had any chance to address it, something entirely physical and therefore entirely inconvenient. She walked back to the yard at a normal pace. He was already dismounted when she arrived. "Mr. Graves," she said, "your man already came for the heifers." "I know," he said. "He told me they made the trip well." "They did." A pause. "I came to ask you something that isn't strictly business," he said. He held his hat in both hands. She noticed he had done that the first time too at the table, and she now understood it was a habit of his when he was being careful about something. "Go ahead," she said. "I'd like to call on you," he said. "Properly, if you're willing to receive a caller." The directness of it surprised her. She had expected some kind of circling approach, the way men usually managed these things, talking around the edges for so long that by the time they said what they meant she had already grown impatient. He simply said it, standing there in her yard with his hat in his hands and his gray-green eyes looking at her with the same considered attention he had given her cattle. She said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Graves. I'd prefer it. I have not thought about anything beyond this property and my son and my work for 3 years. I'm not entirely certain I know how to think about anything else." "I don't need anything from you except the chance to spend some time in your company," he said. "That's all I'm asking for. I'm not asking you to change your mind about anything. I wouldn't presume to." She looked at him. "You live 30 miles north." 38, you said. "It's a considerable distance." "A man can ride 38 miles, he said. "It's not the hardest thing I've done." She thought about Eli saying he looked at her the way Mr. Calder looked at Mrs. Calder. She thought about the way the kitchen had felt different with 3 people in it, fuller, more like a home and less like a working structure. "You may call on me," she said. "I won't promise anything beyond that." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. Then with that almost smile, "May I come in for coffee?" She let him in for coffee. He came again 2 weeks later and then again 2 weeks after that, and the second visit lasted through supper, and the third lasted through the evening meal, and a long conversation by the fire in the sitting room while Eli did his school reading in the corner, falling asleep in his chair by 8 o'clock, and Mamie sat across from Jasper Graves with her mending in her lap and the fire between them, and talked and listened in roughly equal measure. He talked about Tennessee, about the farm his family had worked for 3 generations, about leaving it. He talked about his father, who was a serious man who had very few words but used each one precisely, and about his mother, who had died when he was 16 and who he missed in the specific way of someone who learned a lesson from a person and can no longer ask them if they learned it correctly. He talked about the trail drives, the violence and the beauty of them, the scale of the plains at night when you were 3 weeks from the nearest town, and the stars were the only map you had. She talked more than she had talked to anyone in 3 years. She told him about learning to shoot when Thomas was sick, and she knew the cattle needed a guardian regardless of what happened with her husband. She told him about the worst winter after Thomas died, the winter of 1880 when the ice storm had killed 2 of her remaining cows, and she had sat in this same sitting room and considered, with a calm that frightened her in retrospect, whether she could sell the property and take Eli back east to her sister in Columbus. She told him what had made her decide not to, not any particular belief in herself or her prospects, but simply the fact that Thomas had chosen this land, and she was not ready to let his choice be the thing that failed. Jasper Graves listened. He did not say it would have been understandable to leave, the way most people did when she told this story, the way people said understandable things because they did not know what to say and understandable was safe. He said, "I know that feeling, where the stubbornness becomes indistinguishable from the reason, where you can't tell anymore if you're staying because you believe in it or because you won't let go. And then at some point it doesn't matter which one it was, because the result is the same." She looked at him over her mending and felt something in her chest that was not warmth this time but something more structural, something shifting. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." By December they were on first names. She was not certain precisely when it had happened, only that one Thursday evening she looked up from the fire and said, "Jasper," without thinking about it, and he answered without comment, as if it had always been so. He brought Eli a book about the history of the Western Territories for Christmas, a proper bound book with illustrations, and Eli received it with a gravity that suggested he understood it was a meaningful gift from a person attempting to be meaningful to their household, and said thank you with such earnestness that Mamie had to look away again. Jasper stayed 3 days over Christmas, sleeping in the small spare room that she had previously used for storage, and that she had cleaned out without examining her reasons too closely. The 3 days had a quality she could not quite name, a texture of ordinariness that felt extraordinary simply because it had been so absent from her life. There were meals together, and there was Eli talking more than she had heard him talk in months, and there were evenings by the fire where the conversation ran on long past any reasonable stopping point, and the fire burned down to coals, and neither of them moved to end it. On the third day, the day he was to leave, they were standing on the porch in the cold morning air, their breath making small clouds, and he turned to her and said, "Mamie, I want you to know what this means to me." "What does it mean to you?" "It means more than I have words for," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not going to push you toward anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know that I have not thought about anything other than this property and the people on it since September." She looked at the winter-brown fields. "I have thought about things other than this property," she said carefully. "I have recently thought about things considerably more specific than that." He turned toward her. There was nothing performing about his expression, nothing prepared. He was simply a man in a cold morning looking at her with everything he felt laid entirely plain in his face. And she found she was looking at him the same way, with nothing held back and no strategy, just the plain fact of what had happened in the last 3 months between two careful, stubborn, work-hardened people who had not been looking for anything and had found it anyway. He reached out and took her hand, which was bare because she had come outside without her gloves, and his hand was warm around hers. "All right," she said very quietly, not as a surrender, as a decision. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so simple and deliberate that she felt it in her entire chest, and she stood in the cold morning air on her porch and let herself feel it without argument. He rode out after breakfast, and she stood at the gate and watched him go, and this time Eli did not say anything because he was 11 and could read a room. January was hard on the plains, as January always was. The temperature dropped below zero for 2 weeks in a row, and the creek froze over, and she had to break the ice every morning to water the animals. Ko came down sick with an influenza that swept through the surrounding farms, and she managed most of the daily labor herself for 10 days, working from before dawn to after dark, too tired at night for anything beyond a brief entry in her farm journal and sleep. She got 2 letters from Jasper in January. He was a deliberate writer, as she had expected. His letters were not flowery, but they were specific, and specificity from him was its own kind of tenderness. He wrote about his land, about a late-season storm that had kept him and his men in the barn for 2 days, about a decision he was weighing regarding a land acquisition that might double his acreage if he moved quickly on it. He wrote, "I think about the Whitfield kitchen and the fire in the sitting room, and I find myself planning things I haven't planned in a long time. I wanted you to know that." She wrote back. Her letters were longer than his, which surprised her, because she had always thought of herself as a spare writer. She found she had things to say to him that had been accumulating for 3 years with nowhere to go. He came again in February, riding through a late-season frost with a coat dusted white at the shoulders and color in his face from the cold. She opened the door before he knocked because she had heard the bay horse on the road from the upstairs window where she had been mending curtains, and she stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her, and he looked at her from the yard with an expression that stopped her breath. "You look," he said, and then paused, and she could see him choosing his words, "like you're the most solid thing I know." She stepped aside to let him in and took his coat and hung it on the peg beside hers in the hallway, and they stood very close for a moment in the narrow entry, closer than they had been before, and the house was warm, and outside the frost was pressing against the windows. He kissed her in the hallway, their first kiss, and it was brief and careful, and when they separated she felt that her whole architecture had rearranged itself around a new weight, something permanent taking up residence in the place where 3 years of deliberate emptiness had been. "I should mention," she said, "that Eli is upstairs." "I know," he said. "I'll be on my best behavior." "You are always on your best behavior. It is occasionally inconvenient." He laughed, surprised, and she felt the laugh against her hand where it had come to rest against his chest, felt the shape of it moving through him. In March, after his 4th visit, Jasper Graves said to her, they were in the kitchen. She was teaching him to make her cornbread because he had complained that his hired man's version was inedible, and he was standing at the counter with flour on his hands looking entirely natural in her kitchen in a way that she had stopped trying not to notice. He said, "I've been thinking about the land acquisition I wrote you about. The property north of yours. I've decided not to buy it." She turned from the stove. "Why, you said the price was good." "The price is very good," he agreed. "But it would mean a significant investment of time and capital in building up a second operation that would take the next 2 years at minimum to become productive." He looked at his floured hands. "And I've been thinking that there might be a better use of my resources, a different kind of expansion." She watched him. She was good at waiting. "Your eastern fence line is still down," he said. "It is. Your south pasture could carry another 30 head if it was irrigated from the upper creek section." "I know that. The Whitfield property and mine are both on the Arkansas watershed. They're not contiguous, but with the parcel that Holly's Prute has been trying to sell for 2 years, they nearly would be." She set down the spoon she was holding. "Jasper," he looked at her, "I'm doing this badly." "No," she said. "You're doing it the way you do everything, precisely and from the ground up, but I'd appreciate it if you got to the point." He set down the bowl he was holding and looked at her with the full directness that she had come to understand was how he looked at things he was completely certain about. "I would like to marry you, Mamie. I would like to build something with you. Not because your land and my land make sense together, although they do. Because you make sense to me in a way that very little else has. And I am 36 years old, and I have been careful for long enough that I know what careful is protecting me from and what it's keeping from me." The kitchen was warm. Through the window the March wind was working at the last of the winter-brown grass, turning it toward the first faint green of the season. She could hear Eli in the barn, which was close enough to the kitchen that his movements were audible through the quiet afternoon. "You would be taking on a widow with a farm and an 11-year-old boy," she said. "I'm aware. The farm is encumbered. There's a note on it from the bank in Caldwell that I've been paying down but have not finished. I'm aware of that too. You told me in a letter. Eli has opinions. I've noticed. I like his opinions." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the man in her kitchen with flour on his hands who had ridden 38 miles repeatedly through a Kansas winter, because he thought the trip was worth making, who had listened to her more carefully than she had been listened to in years, who had looked at her cattle with genuine understanding and looked at her with the same quality of attention, the kind that implied nothing was being overlooked or taken for granted. "Yes," she said. His expression, which had been held carefully in reserve, opened like a gate unlatched. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, Jasper. I would very much like to build something. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and she went to meet him, and he put his arms around her with a contained forcefulness that was exactly him, exactly the way he was, nothing wasted and nothing held back. And she let her head rest briefly against his chest and heard his heart going faster than she would have guessed. What about Eli? She said into his shoulder, "With your permission, I'd like to speak to him myself." She pulled back to look at him. "He's 11, you don't need his permission." "No," he said. "I'd like to ask for it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "He's in the barn," she said. He went to the barn. She stayed in the kitchen and tried to go back to the cornbread and could not. She stood at the window and watched the distance between the house and the barn. It was 15 minutes before they came back, the two of them, Eli walking beside Jasper with the particular posture of a boy who has been treated as someone worth consulting, and is carrying the responsibility of that carefully. His expression was complicated in the way that things are complicated when you want something and also feel the weight of wanting it, when the wanting is mixed up with the memory of what you lost. Eli came into the kitchen and looked at his mother. "He asked me," Eli said. "I know." "I said yes," Eli said. "I told him he had to keep his promises, though. I told him that was the condition." Mamie looked at Jasper over her son's head. Jasper looked back at her with his eyes bright. "That's a very reasonable condition," she said to Eli. "He agreed to it," Eli said, in the tone of someone who has managed a successful negotiation. "I gathered." Eli looked between the two of them and then went to finish his chores with the dignity of a person who has conducted important business. And the kitchen was warm, and the cornbread was slightly too done on the bottom, and outside the Kansas spring was beginning in earnest. They married in April at the small Baptist church in the nearest town, 11 miles from the Whitfield property. It was not a large ceremony. The minister and his wife, her neighbor Sarah Calder, and her husband George, who was the Mr. Calder whose looks Eli had referenced in the autumn, Ko, who was her hired man, and the 2 Graves ranch hands named Donal and Pruitt, who had ridden down from Wichita. Eli stood beside his mother, and then beside Jasper alternately, not knowing quite where he belonged, and partway through the ceremony Jasper put a hand on his shoulder, and he stayed there. She wore her best dress, which was brown wool with a cream collar and cuffs, and her hair up, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Sarah Calder had collected from the creek bank that morning. She was not a woman who had thought a great deal about weddings. She had planned her first marriage at 19 with more excitement than wisdom, and had not known until years later how lucky she had been in the outcome, that the man she had chosen without full knowledge had turned out to be good and honest and hardworking and kind, that the gamble of youth had paid into something real. She was 32 now, and she was not making a gamble. She was making a decision with full knowledge, and the difference was everything. Jasper Graves stood at the front of that church in a clean white shirt and a dark coat she had not seen him wear before, and looked at her as she walked toward him with an expression of such unguarded seriousness, such plain and entire conviction, that she felt it reach all the way through her. The minister said the words. They said theirs. She felt the ring go on her finger, plain gold, smooth, and Jasper's hands around hers were steady and warm, and when the minister said he could kiss his wife he looked at her first, checking, the way he always checked, the way he never assumed, and she answered by leaning in. Eli cheered. Just Eli, just her boy in the quiet church, one single whoop of genuine delight that he immediately tried to suppress but couldn't, and everyone laughed. And that was how it ended and began. The first weeks of the marriage had a quality of practical joy that she had not expected, but that suited her perfectly. Jasper brought himself and his 2 hands and his bay horse and his good sense, and a wagon load of equipment from the Wichita ranch that represented the beginning of the consolidation of their operations. Donal and Pruitt were good workers, respectful and capable, and the dynamic of the Whitfield spread changed from a small, straining household to something with more capacity, more range. They spent the first weeks of April repairing the eastern fence line, the 4 of them working in 2 teams, Jasper and Mamie on one stretch, Ko and Donal on the other, with Pruitt driving the post wagon between them. It was honest, bone-tiring work, the kind that ends conversations early in the evening and makes sleep come immediately. And in the middle of it there were moments, her hands on a fence post, his on the wire, both of them in the same rhythm that felt like the solid foundation of something, the real thing, as opposed to the formal and ceremonial version of the real thing. He was a careful man, but not a closed one. She had expected some version of adjustment, some friction in the seams of two lives joined together, and there was some, mostly logistical, whose methods applied in which situations, how the daily labor was divided, how decisions about the animals were made. They had one actual argument in the first month, about the irrigation plan for the south pasture, where they each had strong and diverging opinions. It was a real argument, sharp and specific, no performance on either side, and when it was done and the practical question had been resolved through a compromise that had elements of both their approaches, she felt something that surprised her satisfaction. Not that she had won or that he had, but that they had argued the way two people argue when they both know the relationship can hold it, when the argument itself is proof of the respect underneath. She told him that, and he looked at her for a moment with that sage-rain-colored gaze and said, "I noticed that too." And then he said, "I married a remarkable woman." "You married a practical one," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." The summer of 1883 was good to the Whitfield Graves operation, which was what the ranch was becoming, something that had both names in it, both histories. The South Pasture irrigation plan worked. The new cattle that Jasper had brought from his Wichita herd integrated with Mamie's lines, with a productive vigor that both of them had hoped for, but neither had entirely counted on. By August, they had 120 head on the combined property, healthy and well-fed on the improved pasture. And when Mamie did the figures in her leather notebook on an August evening, sitting at the kitchen table while the last light faded outside, she felt the numbers under her hands like something solid, like ground where there had been air. Jasper was behind her, reading one of Eli's books that the boy had lent him with the solemnity of a librarian extending a particular privilege. He looked up and saw her expression. "Good, very good," she said. "Better than last year, considerably better than the year before." He got up and came to look over her shoulder at the figures, his hands on the back of her chair, his presence behind her warm and specific and entirely unremarkable in the way that truly settled things become unremarkable. He read the figures with his careful attention. "If next summer holds," he said, "if next summer holds, we could buy the Pruitt parcel. Holly's Pruitt still wants too much for it. Holly's Pruitt will want less in a year if the county keeps moving the way it is and he can't find another buyer." Jasper was quiet, considering. Then he said, "You'd better be right about that." "I'm frequently right," she said. "Consistently right," he said. "It's occasionally humbling." She laughed, and he kissed the top of her head, and she set down the notebook and turned in her chair to look up at him. This man who had ridden down from Wichita to buy cattle and had found something neither of them had been looking for, and had ridden back 38 times, and had asked her son's permission, and who stood in her kitchen as if he had always been the rightful occupant of the space she had been keeping him from without knowing it. "Come to bed," she said. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after she had driven her cattle into the Caldwell fairgrounds, and a man in a weather-worn hat had asked if they were hers, Mamie found out she was expecting a child. She was not surprised. She was not afraid, which she had half expected to be. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Jasper, not from uncertainty, but because she wanted to understand what she felt before she put it into words for someone else. What she felt was something enormous and quiet, like watching a storm gather on the horizon on a warm day, the weight of it ahead, the beauty of it, and the knowledge that it would change everything about the landscape when it arrived, but that the landscape was ready. She told him on the third evening, after Eli had gone to bed. They were in the sitting room, the fire going, and she said it plainly and directly the way she said everything. Jasper Graves set down the newspaper he had been reading and looked at her with an expression that moved through several different things. She watched them go across his face in quick succession, the surprise, the comprehension, the pure and unguarded joy. And then he was beside her on the settee with his arms around her and his face pressed briefly against her hair, and he said nothing at all for a long moment. "Well," he said at last against her hair. "Well, that's all you've got. Give me a minute." He was quiet. His arms were very firm around her. Then he said, "I want you to know that I intend to make a complete fool of myself about this." "I expect nothing less," she said. She felt him laugh. They told Eli the next morning at breakfast. Eli was 12 by then, old enough to have some understanding of what the information meant and young enough that his response was immediate and physical. He pushed back from the table and stood up with his hands flat on the wood. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," Mamie said. "Around May." Eli stared. She watched him compute it. He looked at Jasper, who was watching him with the attentive patience he always brought to the question of Eli, and she saw in her son's face the exact moment when the calculation resolved. "So it'll be mine too," Eli said. "The baby." "It will be your brother or sister," Mamie said. "Yes." Eli sat back down. He picked up his fork. He put it down again. "I've always wanted a brother," he said in a tone that was carefully not hopeful, the tone of someone managing expectations. "We don't know yet," she said. "I know," Eli said, "but I want one." He did not get what he wanted at first. The baby born in May of 1884 was a girl, 7 pounds and furious, who came into the world on a Tuesday morning when the apple blossoms were open in the orchard Thomas had planted, and whose cry was so immediate and full-throated that Jasper, waiting in the kitchen with Eli and the midwife's assistant while the midwife worked upstairs, heard it through the floor and had to put both hands flat on the table to keep himself from bolting up the stairs. When the midwife's assistant called up the all-clear, he took the stairs 3 at a time. Mamie was exhausted and entirely composed, the way she was after any hard work, and she was holding a red-faced, furious, impossibly small person against her chest, and she looked up at Jasper coming through the door with an expression that he had never seen on her before, which was not her practical face or her decided face or even her loving face as he knew it, but some new thing that combined all of them into something more than any of the parts. "Come here," she said. He came to the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter and felt himself undone entirely and without complaint. "She's perfect," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "She's loud," Mamie said, and there was affection in it that covered everything. They named her Clara. Clara Graves, who had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and Eli's exact attitude toward the world, which was to say she met it directly and did not apologize for taking up space. Eli, after his first careful look at her in Mamie's arms, informed the household that she was acceptable and that he would teach her to fix fences when she was old enough. And Jasper told him that was an excellent plan, and Mamie said she thought they were both getting ahead of themselves by approximately 14 years, which was dismissed by both parties. The ranch in 1885 was a different place from the one Mamie had stood alone on in 1879, and different again from what it had been when Jasper came down from Wichita to buy cattle. The combined operation was running 160 head on the original Whitfield property plus 30 acres they had acquired from a neighboring family who had given up their Kansas homestead after 2 hard seasons and moved back east. Jasper had sold his Wichita property in the winter of 1884, a decision he had made with Mamie over 2 evenings of careful conversation and 1 long night of figures in the notebook that she had long since transferred to a proper bound ledger. The Wichita sale had given them the capital to make a real offer on the Prout parcel. Holly's Prout had indeed become more reasonable, as Mamie had predicted, his asking price coming down by nearly 1/3 as his circumstances shifted and the right buyer failed to materialize. She had gone with Jasper to Prout's farm to conclude the sale, and Prude had shaken her hand with something between grudging respect and deep discomfort, the expression of a man confronting evidence that he had been wrong about a person in a way that cost him money. She was not particularly gracious about it. She was cordial and direct and exact, which was her nature, and that had to be enough. The Prude parcel added another 60 acres to their operation, including the stretch of creek bank that Mamie had wanted since the second year of her widowhood, since she had ridden the property line and understood what the water access would mean for year-round grazing. Standing on the new parcel in the autumn of 1885, walking the creek bank while Jasper estimated the cost of additional fencing, and Clara sat on his shoulders making observations about the water, and Eli walked ahead checking the fence line with the proprietary confidence of a boy who has been taught something well, Mamie felt the landscape of her life settle into a configuration that felt completed, not in the sense of being done, but in the sense of a thing that has found its right proportions. She had turned her last good season into the finest cattle in the county, as more than one person in Caldwell had told her when she drove them in that September morning in 1882, 3 years ago now. She had done it alone and by force of will and a stubbornness that she had originally mistaken for grief. And then a man in a weather-worn hat had stood at her fence line and looked at her cattle, and then looked at her and not been able to stop. And whatever that attention had been, whatever he had seen, it had been the beginning of something that she had not planned and could not have and would not now revise for any consideration. "What are you thinking?" Jasper asked, coming to stand beside her on the creek bank, having transferred Clara to Eli's considerably more reluctant shoulders. "I'm thinking about that morning in Caldwell in 1882, she said. "The fairgrounds." "I think about that morning," he said. "What do you think about it?" "I think about the way you were standing at the fence," he said, "writing in that notebook without looking up. I thought whoever this woman is, she knows exactly what she's doing. And then you looked up and I thought I am in considerable difficulty. You hid it very well. I tried, I'm not sure I managed it." "You didn't," she said, "but I was polite about it." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the creek went by with its cold, particular sound, and Eli made a sound of theatrical protest at Clara pulling his hair, and the sky was the exact color it had been that morning in Caldwell, that impossibly transparent Kansas blue. The next 3 years shaped themselves around the rhythms of the land and the people who had chosen it. The cattle operation grew, not dramatically, but steadily, which was how Mamie preferred things to grow. She was not a woman interested in spectacle or in scale for its own sake. She was interested in soundness, in things that would stand up to the hard years as well as the good ones. She began to teach in the evenings what she knew, in the manner of someone who has learned things so painstakingly that sharing them becomes its own form of completion. Eli was her first student in the formal sense, though he had been her informal student for years, and he took to the cattle work with a thoroughness that made her proud in a way that had no performance in it. By 1886, at 15, he was handling negotiations with buyers himself under her oversight, and the buyers who arrived expecting to be dealing with the adult Graves couple were often startled to find themselves in a three-way conversation where the 15-year-old had opinions and the documentation to back them up. Clara, for her part, was not interested in negotiations. Clara was interested in horses, exclusively, and with the total devotion of a person who has found their subject early and will not be redirected. She was on a horse before she could reliably walk, sitting in front of Jasper or Mamie or Eli or Ko, and by the time she was 2 she was demanding her own horse, and by 3 she had one, a patient small brown mare that Jasper found through a dealer in Wichita, and that Clara named, after careful deliberation, Biscuit. In 1887, Mamie had a second child. A boy this time, as promised by nothing and no one but who arrived anyway in February, blonde-haired and serene, where Clara had been dark and loud. A baby who seemed from the first days of his life to have made a private agreement with the world that he would take it as he found it. They named him Thomas, after her first husband, and she saw in Jasper's face, when she asked him if he minded the name, only the particular warmth of a man who understood what was being honored without feeling displaced by it. "Of course," he said, "of course that's his name." Eli, who was 15 when Thomas was born, accepted the baby with the same considered propriety with which he had accepted everything, examined him carefully, announced that he was, like Clara, acceptable, and resumed his fence work. Clara, who was 3, was less restrained about it. She called Thomas "my baby" from the first day and refused to countenance any correction of this terminology, which was so exactly her character that no one tried very hard. Thomas Graves grew up to be the quietest person on the property by a considerable margin, which in a household that included Mamie's precise efficiency, Jasper's deliberate thoroughness, Eli's developing opinions, and Clara's opinions at full volume from the age of 2, was perhaps adaptive. He was the child who sat still at the table while others moved, who watched and processed and waited. He was, Mamie thought sometimes, watching him from the kitchen window on an autumn afternoon in 1891, when he was 4 years old and sitting in the yard with a stick drawing something in the dirt with complete absorption, while Clara explained loudly from somewhere behind the barn why her interpretation of the fence repair protocol was superior to Eli's, the most purely contented person she had ever known. In 1888, at the Caldwell County Agricultural Exhibition, the Whitfield Graves operation was awarded a first-place designation for breeding stock, the first time the award had gone to a woman's operation since the exhibition's founding. The designation actually said Graves Ranch on the certificate, which was the name the operation had taken when they registered it with the county office. But everyone who received the certificate knew who had built the foundation of the breeding program and who had driven the original 63 head into Caldwell on a September morning in 1882, when there was nothing left but one last good season and the nerve to make it count. The newspaper in Caldwell wrote a brief note about the award and mentioned Mrs. Graves in the context of having inherited the operation from her first husband, which was the kind of thing newspapers wrote in 1888 and which made Jasper angrier than it made Mamie. "It doesn't say anything about what you built," he said, reading the note at the kitchen table. "No," she said, "it makes it sound as though you simply maintained something." "Men often think that's what women do," she said. "Maintain. The building part is harder to see when they're not the ones watching." "I saw it," he said quietly. "I know you did," she said. "That's not nothing." He looked at her across the table for a moment with the full directness of a man who has spent 6 years learning a person and is still finding things worth knowing. "It's not nearly enough," he said. "It's enough," she said. "For me." In 1889, Eli turned 18. He was, by this point, taller than Jasper by half an inch, which Jasper accepted with good humor, and he had a way of managing the cattle operation that was measurably his own, distinct from either his mother's methods or his stepfather's, a synthesis that surprised both of them with its effectiveness. He had, over the last several years, also developed strong opinions about the situation of the various people who worked the surrounding land, particularly the Tejano families in the southern part of the county, who continued to face pressures on their land tenure that had nothing to do with their competence and everything to do with the particular shape of injustice that the expanding cattle economy had brought with it. K.O. had worked for Mamie since the 2nd year of her widowhood and had never once been given less than his full wage, which was more than some of his neighbors received from operations run by people who found ways to justify paying men less when they believed those men had fewer options. He and his family lived on a small piece of land adjacent to the Whitfield Graves property that Mamie had helped him secure the title to in 1885, not from charity, but from the practical understanding that a man with a title to his own ground had a different kind of stability than a man without one, and stability in the people you depended on was simply good management, on top of being right. Eli had watched this and had drawn his own conclusions about what it meant to run an operation with honesty. And in 1889, when a consortium of larger ranchers in the county tried to push through a water rights arrangement that would have cut off 3 Tejano families from the creek access they had used for decades, Eli was the one who showed up at the county commissioner's office with documentation and testimony, and the Whitfield Graves name behind him. And Mamie was the one who went with him and sat in the front row and looked at the commissioner with the particular expression she had that made people reconsider their conclusions. The water rights arrangement did not go through. K.O., when he heard, sat down in the Whitfield Graves kitchen with his hat in his hands and said thank you in a way that was not a small thing and was not treated as one. Eli found a young woman in 1890 whose name was Ada Prescott, a school teacher from one of the newer settlements west of the county seat, who had come to teach the children of the farming families, and had, in the manner of capable people who find their surroundings interesting, become thoroughly involved in the community in which she found herself. She had dark hair and a way of asking questions that suggested she actually wanted the answers, and Eli brought her to the ranch in March of 1890 with the self-consciousness of a young man bringing a person to be examined by people whose opinions mattered to him. Mamie liked her immediately, which she kept to herself for the first 2 visits because Eli was 18 and needed to come to his own conclusions. By the 3rd visit, she told him privately that Ada Prescott was an exceptional person and that he would be doing himself a considerable service to not let her get away, which was the most directional thing she had said to him about anything personal since the matter of the arithmetic he had skipped in favor of watching the cattle years ago. He had not let Ada get away. They were married in the summer of 1891 at the Baptist church in town, the same church where Mamie and Jasper had been married 8 years before, and the ceremony had a quality of continuity that she found moving in a way she did not expect. She stood beside Jasper in the church with Clara on her other side and Thomas between them, and watched her son become a married man, and felt the full complicated joy of it, the pride, the love, the specific grief that comes with milestones, the sense that Thomas Whitfield was somehow present in the fact of his son standing upright in the world. She said something of this to Jasper, quietly, in the churchyard afterward, while Eli and Ada received the congratulations of the assembled guests. "He'd be proud," Jasper said, not as consolation, but as a statement of fact about a man he had never met but knew through the evidence of what that man had built and loved. "He would be," she said. "And he'd be glad about you. I want you to know I think that." Jasper was quiet for a moment. He took her hand. "Thank you," he said. "That means a great deal." Clara turned 7 in 1891 and was, by general consensus of everyone who knew her, the most forceful personality in the county. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and some third quality that was entirely her own, a particular kind of incandescent energy that burned hot and consistent, and had no apparent source because it required no fuel beyond itself. She had by this point negotiated the ownership of 3 horses Biscuit, who was now her original horse and slightly past her usefulness as a working animal, and 2 others she had acquired through means that Mamie had been too impressed by to fully interrogate, and rode them with a competence that made the ranch hands stop what they were doing to watch. She was going to be difficult in the best possible way, Mamie thought, which was to say she was going to be exactly herself at full volume, and the world was going to have to manage. Thomas Graves at 4 years old was Clara's complete opposite in manner, and her exact equal in stubbornness of a quieter kind. He had decided he was going to know everything about how things worked, and he pursued this goal in the methodical, patient way that was his nature, following Jasper around the ranch with the focused attention of a student who has decided on a subject and means to master it. Jasper, who had waited his whole life for exactly this situation without knowing it, accepted the role of master to this particular apprentice with a tenderness that Mamie watched from a careful distance because it undid her completely, and she preferred to maintain her composure. In 1892, Eli and Ada had a son. They named him Thomas Eli Graves, and the double Thomas of it made Mamie's eyes fill at the announcement, which she managed by immediately going to look at the child and commenting practically on his considerable lung capacity. The decade moved forward the way the best decades do, with enough difficulty to make the good years meaningful and enough good years to make the difficulty manageable. There were hard seasons. 1893 was a year of drought that cost them 20 head and required them to sell at lower prices than they had in years. And there was a year when Clara's horse threw her and broke her arm, and the 2 weeks before it was clear the healing was going to be complete were the longest 2 weeks of Mamie's adult life. But the foundation they had built held. In the spring of 1894, on a morning that looked very much like the morning of their wedding 12 years before, Mamie stood on the porch of the house that she had finished building after Thomas Whitfield died, and that she had since extended by 2 rooms and a proper back porch. And she looked out over the ranch that was simultaneously hers and Jasper's, and the place where 2 lives had been woven together so thoroughly that she could no longer have said with certainty where one ended and the other began. The apple orchard was in bloom. 6 trees, the same 6 that Thomas had planted and that she had kept alive through 3 dry summers, their blossoms exactly as white and generous as they had been every April since she had first seen them, when she was 19 and newly married, and the world was enormous and uncharted. Jasper came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her and gave her one, and they stood together in the apple-scented morning without speaking, which was the particular luxury of 12 years of marriage, the silence that needed no explanation because everything in it was already understood. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you came down that road in September of 1882, she said, "and stood at my fence and asked if those cattle were mine, I thought you were going to be a transaction. I thought you were going to be a buyer who paid a fair price and rode back to wherever he came from, and that was the end of it." "I know," he said. "You were very efficient about the whole thing." "I was terrified," she said. "Not of you, of the other thing, of the possibility that I might want something beyond the next fence line. I had decided I was done wanting things that could be taken away." He was quiet, listening. "I want you to know," she said, "that whatever I thought I was protecting when I built all of this, I was wrong about what the protection was for. It wasn't protection for Eli or for the property. It was protection for myself, against having to be this." She gestured not specifically at the orchard and the fields and the morning, "against wanting this much. And now I think I was protecting the right thing for the wrong reason," she said. "I was protecting something worth protecting. I just didn't know yet what it was waiting for." Jasper took her hand, the one not holding the coffee, and held it in the plain, unhurried way that was entirely his, that had never once been a performance or a gesture, that was simply a man with his hand around the hand of the person he had chosen and would choose again. "I came to buy cattle," he said. "You did. Best purchase I ever made." She laughed, the clear, unself-conscious laugh that had taken 2 years of his company to come fully out of her. "I sold you the cattle." "You sold me the cattle," he agreed. "I kept the rest." The morning spread out before them, the apple blossoms moving in a light wind, the cattle in the east pasture making their low morning sounds, Clara's voice already carrying from somewhere near the barn, Thomas's more measured footsteps crossing the yard toward the chicken coop with the focused purpose of a child who has assigned himself a task and means to complete it, Eli and Ada's wagon visible on the approach road coming for the Sunday meal they had started having every week. The small shape of their son Thomas Eli sitting upright between his parents on the wagon bench. The county had changed around them. Caldwell was bigger now, the cattle trade having shifted north and west, the town settling into a different commerce that had less of the wildness of the early years and more of the permanence that follows when people decide to stay. The Kishom Trail was nearly done as a working route, The railheads had moved, and the long drives were giving way to more local operations, which suited the Whitfield Graves approach perfectly. They had never been a trail operation. They had been a breeding operation from the beginning, from the moment she had bartered her way into Holly's Prout's bulls and decided that quality was worth more than quantity, and that a good animal properly raised was worth 10 ordinary ones given no thought. She had been right about that. She was right about most things, which she did not say often because the one time she had said it to Jasper, he had given her such a look of sincere, amused agreement that she had felt obscurely embarrassed by having stated it at all. What she had not been right about was the possibility of being loved again. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about the specific form it would take, not the overwhelming tide of young love, not the sweeping, disorienting thing of first experience, but this solid, present, daily, accumulated thing. This man who had ridden 38 miles in the January cold because he thought the ride was worth making. This set of hands that knew her ranch as well as she did. This voice that said her name in the mornings when the day was beginning, and in the evenings when the day was done, and both times meant the same thing, which was, I am here. I am choosing this. I am choosing you. She set down her coffee cup on the porch rail and turned to face him. He looked at her, and there it was, 11 years after the first time she had seen it, that considering look that was not the quick judgment of a man deciding what he thought of a woman, but the slow, unguarded attention of a man who is still finding things worth learning. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm looking at you. You look at me all the time. I do, she said. I expect I'll keep doing it. He smiled at her. The full smile that she had waited 3 months to see the first time, and that she still watched for because it was so entirely his, warm and contained, and meaning more than it showed. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood like that on the porch of the house she had built and he had come to. And the apple blossoms moved in the April wind, and Eli's wagon came down the road, and Clara shouted something triumphant from near the barn, and Thomas crossed the yard with his chicken feed, and the morning went on in all its full and ordinary particulars, which were extraordinary in the way that only the things worth keeping are extraordinary, and Mamie Whitfield, who had turned her last good season into something the county talked about for years, stood in the middle of all she had built and felt it around her like the most substantial thing in the world, like ground, like home, like permanence she had earned. The years ahead would have more hard seasons and more good ones. There would be the drought of 1895 that they would weather together. There would be the year Clara won the first women's riding prize at the Caldwell exhibition and refused to accept the modification they tried to make to the award's language, standing in the middle of the fairground with her hands on her hips at 12 years old, and saying loudly that she had ridden the same course as everyone else and her award should say so. And the committee had capitulated not because they wanted to, but because Clara Graves looked exactly like her mother when she had made a decision, and no committee in the county had learned to stand up to Mamie Whitfield when she had made a decision. Thomas would grow up to be a man of extraordinary patience and significant mechanical aptitude, who would eventually turn the Whitfield Graves operation towards some of the new farming methods coming out of the land-grant colleges, reading agricultural bulletins with the same systematic attention his mother had given the pamphlets of 20 years before. Eli and Ada would have 2 more children after Thomas Eli, a daughter they named Margaret and a second son they named Jasper, which made the man for whom the name was chosen sit very still at his kitchen table for several minutes and clear his throat more than once. But those years were ahead. On this morning, on this porch, in this April light, Mamie had everything she could see and most of what she had never expected. She had driven 63 head of cattle into Caldwell in the autumn of 1882 with the proceeds of her last good season and the accumulated stubbornness of 3 years alone, and the private determination that she was going to make something that lasted. She had done that. She had made something that lasted. She had made more than that. And Jasper Graves had come to buy cattle and had found himself unable to stop looking at the woman who had built them, and he had done the sensible thing, which was to keep coming back until she let him stay, and then he had stayed with everything he had. It was a plain story in the way that the best stories are plain. No extraordinary circumstances, no spectacle. Just two people in the middle of the Kansas plains, in the middle of their lives, who had recognized in each other something worth keeping and had been brave enough and stubborn enough and honest enough to act on it. The orchard Thomas Whitfield had planted went on blooming every April, as it always had, as it always would. And on the porch of the house she had built, Mamie Whitfield, always, in the part of herself that had built everything first, stood in her husband's arm in the April morning, and watched the life she had made coming down the road toward her, and felt, in the full and unambiguous sense of the word, entirely, enduringly, completely home.